This morning, as usual, I'm going to share with you some of the points we have emphasized in last night's lecture. But let me remind you once again that these sharings are not carefully planned, and they come out from my, if you like, my heart, my feelings, very spontaneously, naturally, because I believe this is the way that I think what we call sermon, Buddhist sermon should be conducted. This is my personal belief. So they are not properly planned and less still, with notes and with PPT or anything like that. And therefore you must bear with me. Sometimes things seem to be fragmented, and one topic may lead to another, and some of the things I have wanted to talk in my mind, I suddenly inadvertently leave them out and so on. Okay? So now we have been sharing on my lectures on meditation. In fact, that is in the context of our lectures on the Bhayabherava Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. We have come to the section on the meditation, and we have been talking about it in the last 2 weeks. Last night we looked at the wording very carefully for each, that is in the Pali, for each of the jhanas, and then we compare them also in further details with the Sanskrit and the Chinese sources. One point I made concerning this kind of comparison is that I lament that many Chinese Buddhists, although they know Chinese well, they have not realized the importance of the material preserved in Chinese, and particularly those translated from the great master玄奘. Now it is certainly very, very important, very valuable to understand the Pali abhidhamma, and I'm so happy that in fact we are able to sponsor lectures and emphasize them, particularly because these materials are written in a language, in Pali, which is the original Indic language, although certainly we can't claim that this was the language spoken by the Buddha himself. But I have emphasized one point, that even to understand the Pali material, we have to be objective, we have to, as people, go even above the Pali tradition. Just like if we want to understand Mahayana, we really must go beyond the Mahayana tradition, and we cannot be stuck and be attached to the Mahayana tradition. And we have to find out, for instance, what has been said historically, preserved in the Pali accounts, in the Pali Suttas, and we also have to look into the abhidhamma materials and materials preserved in a school like the Sarvastivada and so on. So our approach has been, our emphasis has been a non-sectarian one. So the same should apply to even our study of the Pali material. Important as they are, valuable as they are, if we want to really have a broader perspective and a better appreciation even, a deeper understanding even of the material preserved in Pali, I think we have to go also above it, where possible. And for instance, by comparing parallel material preserved in the Chinese, for instance in the Agamas text preserved in Chinese, and some preserved in Sanskrit fragments. And a lot of materials have been translated, for instance, by玄奘in the Mahavibhasha and in the Abhidharma Bhasha. The strange phenomena is that today, in the modern Chinese community, people don't care much about the Chinese material. But I have pointed out that this was not the case in ancient China. Well,玄奘himself was a great example. Look at him. he was certainly a Mahayanist, right? And he suddenly affiliated himself with the Yogacara tradition, and he was deeply convinced with the Vijjati Matrata doctrine, and he was said to be a devotee of Avalokiteshvara and a great master of Chinese, very, very great master of Chinese. But yet, he risked his life going to India and then spent many years studying all the texts, not only of the Yogacara tradition. He studied the Pratya Paramita, and when he came back to China, he translated at least over 600 fascicles. It's like 600 volumes. It's an amazing thing, that in history, you know, a translator could produce such huge volumes of difficult translations. Besides these texts belonging to the so-called Mahayana, he studied the Abhidhamma text, great master. He studied the Abhidhamma Bhasha, which is very difficult to comprehend, even by any standard, even from the point of view of modern scholars. For instance, Dilavali Pusen translated that text into French, and today that's basically the only translation available. And his text, of course, was further translated into Chinese, into English. And Pusen was said to have studied that text for many, many years, something like 20 years. Just imagine that. Now, Xuán translated it into 30 fascicles. And the Mahavibhasha is now preserved only in Chinese. And it consists, in the Chinese translation, is 200 fascicles. Xuán studied the materials and he translated them. And many of the canonical Abhidhamma texts were translated by him. And in our class, we cited material, for instance, from the Karmaskandas and so on, you see. So you can see that Xuán, although, in other words, in brief, he was himself a Mahayanist, convinced very much with the Mahayana doctrines. Nevertheless, he understood the importance of studying the whole of the Buddha's teaching available to him. And he was able to transcend his own sectarian limit. He studied the so-called Hinayana, he studied the Agama text, he studied the Abhidharma and so on, and became a great master. And today we are so grateful that because of him, we have all this material preserved for us in the Chinese. The Mahavibhasha, for instance, is preserved only in Chinese, actually. Even the original Sanskrit has been lost. And there's another great text called the Jnananusara, Li Lun. That is also preserved only in Chinese. It's a very difficult philosophical text, and he studied and he translated it. So it would be a great pity if the Chinese who already know Chinese simply ignore or neglect this valuable, important material. So in my class, I've been trying to, within, of course, the practical possibilities, the limit of practical possibilities, I've been trying to show how we can benefit from these parallel materials. So coming to this section now on the 4 jhanas, we compare them to the Chinese wordings in the Abhidhamma Bhasha and the Sanskrit in the Vyakya by Yashomitra, and in the Artha Vinishchaya Sutra Nibandhana. So we learn a lot. We mustn't think just because they were not in Pali, they are of lesser value. So in the same way, as I said, the followers of Mahayana mustn't think just because they are not in the Mahayana canon, then they are of lesser importance. We shouldn't think like that. We should objectively learn from the totality of all the Buddhist traditions. Whatever that preserves the Buddha's teaching, whichever tradition preserves Buddha's teaching, then we have to acknowledge, admit that they are the Buddha's teachings. Conversely, even in the Pali text, even Agama text, there may have been a lot of things that betray some sectarian coloring. That is inevitable as the historical documents, because these texts have been passed out for many centuries, and you have different lines of transmission. The Pali translation represents one line, and the Theravada tradition developed from the ancient traditions in India, and you have the Theravada after the first split, and you can say that Theravada as a school, I'm talking about school, actually branch off from the Theravada in India, and from that same branch you have Sarvastivada, for example. We have other schools. They can be known as the Sautrantika and so on, you see. They all came from the Theravada. Theravada actually, if you translate into Pali, it means Theravada. They all came from the ancient Theravada tradition. So all these have equal rights. All these different traditions have equal right to be recognized, or that all these traditions should be recognized as at least potentially containing the authentic teachings of the Buddha. Within each tradition also I talk about the value of, for instance, commentaries and how we should look at commentary. I have also started quoting some materials and translated them into English for you, of course in a very limited way because of the limitation of time and so on in the classroom. But you can see that we also can derive great benefit from looking at the commentaries. So how should we treat the commentary material? On the one hand, it's true to say that commentary materials are later in terms of time of composition at least. For instance, Buddhaghosa, a great commentator, belonged to the 5th century. And other great Indian masters belong to 5th, 6th, and so on. And compared to the time of the Buddha, of course, it's centuries after the Buddha. Yeah? So there are commentary material that are now available for us, valuable as they are, important as they are, were composed in much later time. So we mustn't blindly follow each and every word, each and every explanation, interpretation, exegesis, influencing even the work of a great master like Buddhaghosa. And in fact, it has been pointed out by already many scholars, many Buddhist masters that quite often, in fact, some of the explanations by Buddhaghosa cannot be accepted. When you look at them and compare them to the teaching that we can see in the suttas, for instance. So we have to have our discretions when we look at commentary materials, and from that perspective, it is true to say that it's definitely, absolutely important to go to the suttas themselves instead of relying on the commentary. But on the other hand, we cannot go to the extreme to say that anything in the commentary is late and they are worthless. As I said, the commentary tradition actually must have started even in the Buddha's own time. It's difficult to imagine that the Buddha just said a few words and just went away. You see, he would have said something concisely, very often, and then he would have been asked. And upon being asked, he would have explained things. Or the great disciple would have listened to him and taken mental notes, even though those days most likely there were no written notes as such. They would have taken notes and then remembered the Buddha's explanation and then explained to others. So all these things must have taken place, in other words, in the Buddha's own time, as he was preaching. So this material were passed on continuously in a flow, as it were, in the whole tradition. And even though the commentaries were written later, but this doesn't prevent them from, at least in many places, preserved the actual explanation by the Buddha even, or by the great masters who were the direct disciples of the Buddha. So from that point of view, the commentary material also are very valuable. So in the same way, we should look at the materials preserved in even Sanskrit, Prakrit, even preserved in Chinese translations. Now, of course, it's true that when you look at the material preserved in Chinese translation, these are materials that have been kind of, filtered, as it were, through a linguistic layer. So Chinese translation is Chinese translation, it's not the Indian original. And a translation represents, to a large extent, an interpretation also. So therefore, in that sense, it is less authentic. But on the other hand, the translations, the value of translation also very much depends on the translator's own insight. For instance, in the case of someone like a great master like玄奘, not only that he was a very great master of Sanskrit, so great that today even the greatest Sanskritist among the Buddhist scholars praised him. Like Zàng, for instance, often said that玄奘was a great Sanskritist, Sanskrit master. So suddenly he mastered all the Indian language, he mastered Sanskrit. But mastery of language alone is not enough to produce authentic translations of the Buddha's messages, or at least of Buddhist doctrines.玄奘was also uniquely qualified because he mastered the doctrine as well. He mastered the philosophies. As I've said to you, he had a very objective attitude in understanding the Buddha teaching. He was able to transcend his own traditions, his own affiliations. And the other thing is, he was a great genius. It's difficult to find a second one nowadays. So he was a master not only, in other words, not only of the language or languages, not just even Sanskrit. Apparently he knew other Prakrits also. So not only a master of language, but a master of doctrines as well. The combination is very, very difficult to find even today. One more qualification. Besides that, he was a traditional. We mustn't forget that. He was a man, from what we know, of deep faith, a deep commitment. The picture we got of玄奘was one of being a scholar. That's because we in front of us there were all these translations, and passed down to us by him. So we get the impression that he was a great scholar, but he's certainly much, much more than just being a scholar. Today, that is the ideal we need to achieve. not just scholarship, but scholarship certainly is extremely important. Right? But besides scholarship, the practice, the commitment, the emotions, all these aspects, the spirituality, if you like, of the Buddhist masters are equally important. So today is very, very difficult to find a combination like this. We certainly have one good example in the case of玄奘. So we must understand the value of his translations. He solved a lot of linguistic problems already in those Sanskrit texts, ancient Indian texts. And there were many tricky and ambiguous expressions and even the doctrines. He already understood them, mastered them, because he learned from different masters in India. And he also was a practitioner from his own insight, from his experience. So all these material preserved now in the abhidhamma tradition, in the Mahavibhasha, in Abhidhamma Bhasha, in the Jnananusara, in all these texts, we must, since we already know Chinese, we must make use of them. And that's what we have been trying to do, just in a very humble, in a very, very small, very, very limited way, to show you how we can benefit from such comparison. So that's what we have done also partly in our lectures. Now, talking about the Chinese version and the Pali version of the suttas, of course, unfortunately, in this case,玄奘didn't quite translate the Bhayabherava Sutta, and the translation was certainly not by him, and it was a much earlier translation in the Ekuttara Agama, zàng Aham. And certainly the translation was far from being ideal, usually quite brief, and we were not sure whether the translator fully have mastered those expressions and terms, and also whether the person, the translator involved were able to express sufficiently in the Chinese language, for instance. So there are many, many things to be concerned about, but we have very thorough materials in the Chinese as well. And so because of that, we had to go to translation of玄奘about the description of the four jhanas through his translations in the Abhidhamma text. And there also we find that basically the parallels are quite obvious, and very, very similar translations, from through玄奘's hands. And fortunately, we also have the Abhidharma Bhashya in Sanskrit and the Vyakyas and Artha Vinishaya and so on. We can see the corresponding Sanskrit also. But already we have seen quite a bit of also at the same time differences. For instance, I pointed out how in the description in the second jhana, we see the word ajattam sampasadanam, and we see also the word about cetasa, ekoti bhavam, and how they are to be understood. And we find that modern translators interpret differently, to say the least. Some seem to take them as adjective. Others, in a very vague way, seem to take them as nouns, and so on. But certainly, as far as this respect is concerned, we look at the Sanskrit, we find that these two terms that I've just mentioned actually are in the ablative case, and interpreted in the sense of the instrumental. In other words, about the internal serenity or internal calm, represented by the Pali word ajatang sampasadanam. We find that in the Sanskrit material and also in Zàng translation, clearly it is in the sense of the instrumental, by or from internal serenity, from the unification of the mind. And interestingly, we also note that Yanaponika, for instance, Venerable Yanaponika, the great German monk, and he in fact looked at it that way too, when he was in fact just only translating from the Pali, and he uses the instrumental by. So there are things like this. I'm not going to go on to spend time on this kind of grammatical things here in this sharing, which is supposed to be more like a sermon. But this is just to point out to you that there are many things we can notice and we can ponder over concerning even the wordings, since you cannot be sure that every word is exactly as spelled out or dictated by the Buddha. So sometimes these differences these differences can be important or can be minor ones.